Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another of our webinars on the US elections. It feels a little bit like the Godfather series, if you recall, with Godfather 1, 2, and 3. This is the third in this series. The first focused on the run-up to the elections and the uh, likely outcome of what was seen as a very important election, a consequential election, and concerns as to what the outcome would be. The second conversation was when the election had been called for Joe Biden, but where Trump was not willing to concede, and a lot of uncertainty as to the certification process. We now at the stage where, of course, Biden has been inaugurated, and although Trump has not uh, officially conceded, probably will never, but it is clear that we are well in our way into the Biden administration, into the proverbial 100 days of the Biden administration. And so we have an opportunity really to ask, to have a conversation again with John Madison and Francis Corneguet. They've been the main speakers for the first two conversations, and they actually have a very good track record up until now. I think they called it very well in terms of the outcome of the election, and also the insights in the certification process, and the fact that Trump's attempt to overturn the election was doomed to failure. So 2 out of 2, John and Francis. So well done to you. This part 3 is a lot tougher because while the Biden election victory, there were a lot of signposts that this was going to happen. We are now in the Biden administration, and the real challenges lie ahead, and many of the fault lines are beginning to show themselves, and most particularly is what this threat or challenge of right-wing populism will mean for the Biden administration, and will this be a stumbling block that will hold things back, or whether this is something that the Biden administration will be able to overcome. Now, of course, history is important to understand where we are presently, but I think John and Francis really want to share with us the present situation, obviously drawing on historical lessons for the Biden administration, given the what it is inherited. This rise of right-wing populism, which actually we saw manifested most graphically on January the 6th with the storming of the Capitol. I don't have to introduce John and Francis in a lot of detail, because you're familiar to them. I hope many of you on this call were on the previous conversations, and that you have been following these discussions, and that you have found the conversations valuable and insightful. John, as you know, is a columnist, a radio commentator, has written extensively on American politics and the American situation. Francis similarly lived in the US for many years before coming to South Africa, but follows keenly and closely what is happening in the US. He's very familiar with the history, with the present situation, and he is also a regular contributor himself. And they are called upon for their expertise and insights often on TV and radio programs. So we are very privileged to have John and Francis in conversation on the American elections post the Biden inauguration. So I'm going to ask John to kick us off on some sort of reflections on the current situation that we're in, and also perhaps to look into his crystal ball that has not failed him yet, to understand where the American politics is moving post the Trump defeat. And then Francis will give his reflections as well on similar questions, similar issues, and then we will have John and Francis in conversation. Please don't hesitate to send us your questions. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and we want to have as many of your questions answered by John and Francis, to use the opportunity of their insights and expertise. So please use the chat line, the chat feature, so that we can get your questions and we can make sure that John and Francis have an opportunity to respond to them. So welcome again, and thanks to John and Francis. And John, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. Unmute, John.
Mic is muted.
Okay. Well, thank you, Russell, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to first just reflect on my predictions, because Russell was very kind, but I think we were also a little bit lucky. We said that Biden would probably win, the Democrats would probably take the Senate. We thought they would gain in the House, and they didn't. And in a way, you could say that we were lucky with the Senate, because if it hadn't been for the unusual fact that Georgia had two senators running at the same time because of a special election, because of a retirement, that both candidates were particularly interesting, and more important than anything else, that there'd been this enormous get out the vote movement that had been going for several years under Stacey Abrams in Georgia and many others, that brought a very high black voter turnout. It could quite easily have been that the Democrats did not control the Senate, because as you know, it's now 50-50, and they rely on the Vice President, Kamala Harris, who's of course a Democrat, as the tiebreaker in every election. And what we said at the time was that that would give someone like Joe Manchin, who is perhaps the most conservative Democratic senator, enormous power, because if he says no to Biden, it probably means no. And there's one other conservative senator from Arizona. And so one or two of the most conservative Democrats now have inordinate power. And you may have seen that Joe Manchin used it already by saying he's not going to support one of Biden's picks for the cabinet, Neera Tandem at the Office of Management and Budget. The director is a cabinet post, and he said he doesn't approve of her, and that's probably going to be the end to her ambitions to be in the cabinet. But so we were lucky, but we were right. Where we were perhaps where the polls were not right, we felt that the opinion polls had been corrected from 2016 to add a weighting for the working class, especially white working class, that appeared to have, a non-college educated, that appeared to have been underweighted in the polling. That was corrected from 2016 to 2020, but there were still errors in the polling. And the other thing that, of course, was extraordinary was that the polling was, the turnout was so enormously high. I mean, one has to be focused by the fact that although Trump lost by 7 million votes, he still got close to 10 million more than anyone had ever got in the past, including Hillary Clinton when she beat him by 3 million. He got 73 million to Biden's 81 million. And of course, with the tilting of the outcome because of the electoral college system, the margin of electoral college votes was much closer. And so that's got to be cause for concern for anybody who takes comfort in the Biden victory. We do know there's been a realignment that probably also contributed to the errors in the polling. The suburbanites have gone more for the Democrats, and the working class, including, although in small numbers, significant in percentage terms, African American and Hispanic non-college educated people did move towards Trump and the Republicans. And so you have a real realignment of the kind of politics in both parties. I still think that the two-party system will survive. I don't think the American system is very welcoming to a third party. And so however long it takes, we all know there is this clash between Trump as still the putative leader of the Republican Party, and the next most powerful, most important Republican, Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, and they now openly at war. And that is really a very deep and serious rift for the party. But I think however long it takes to resolve it, I think it will only probably be resolved as the criminal cases against Trump present themselves in court, and only as he starts to diminish in influence because of distractions of the court's possible convictions, that they will really, the Republicans will really be able to look beyond Trump. So that's going to continue for a while. But I think in the end, the way it shakes itself out is you get the two-party system, new people come into the Republican Party. As I say, this is a process that can take a few years. And they evolve an adjusted ideology that puts them in a position to take advantage of a Democratic Party that grows tired and starts to make mistakes that start to tell. I want to say a word about the putsch. You know, January 6th, Francis is going to say more about it, but I did predict it in our earlier sessions that there would be no coup, there'd be no secession of states, that Congress wouldn't take control of the vote, and there wouldn't be anything like that. But I did say Trump would likely incite armed supporters onto the streets, but they wouldn't be successful in challenging the outcome, in part because of what I think I called then Trump's incompetence. He's a brilliant marketer, but there's nothing he was doing that said to me that he could actually change the outcome. He could do enormous damage. I think he's done enormous damage to democracy. More than half of Republican voters today do not believe that the election was fair, even though everything indicates it was. And that delegitimizes democratic government, and that's a cause for great concern. One more point I want to make about the putsch, or two more points. One is that when you look at the court cases that have come, there are now 220 people so far who've been charged. And one of the things that I found interesting is that it emerges that on the Facebook pages and websites that were preparing for the putsch attempt on January 6th, they were advising people, don't bring guns out onto the streets, because Washington, D.C. is a Democratic-controlled city, and they have strong gun laws. So if you bring guns out onto the streets, you're going to be stopped before you even get there. So that's why they were armed with other things. They had tasers, they had these plastic handcuffs, they had poles and other weapons that could be used and were used. But they didn't have guns, and if they'd had guns, of course, it could likely have been much worse. I had sort of conflicting reactions when it happened, because on the one hand, it was so foolish, on the other hand, it was so dangerous. You know, there were people, everybody was taking selfies. One of the comics, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel, called it selfie incrimination, because everybody who just found fire, all the law enforcement officers who went onto the Facebooks and found the selfies could use that as evidence. So it was done very foolishly, but on the other hand, it cannot be taken lightly. 5 people died on the day 2 other officers committed suicide shortly afterwards, and we now know enough to know that their cases, who knows exactly why someone else commits suicide, but they were very, very depressed. The one who committed suicide shortly afterwards had been injured quite severely and concussed at the event. Most of the average person who got sucked into this not to do it again, and then some will potentially get very serious sentences. But I want, and so I ended up hoping that, saying that Biden was doddery in terms of his articulation, but he'd run a very disciplined campaign. And I ended up with the hope that Biden doesn't forget the underlying forces that drove Trump into the White House, such as the unintended victims of globalization, including trade deals, which were fostered by the Democrats as well as Republicans. And I said finally that his cabinet picks would tell us a lot about where he was going. And I must say, when I look at the cabinet, I like it very much. I've seen quite a lot of American commentators have said, oh, it's just the Obama team rewarmed. And I don't see it that way at all, really. Biden has picked the people he wants. On balance, from my point of view, most of them are a shade better than the Obama equivalents, partly because Biden was in the Obama administration. They're able to learn from the experiences of trying to accommodate the Republicans. Obama, in his book, A Promised Land, makes it very clear that he learned the lesson of trying to accommodate the Republicans in the Senate over and over, offering things in bills that he didn't want, like the heavy tax cuts and the lower total of the post financial crisis packages. And they strung him, and he describes one meeting with, I think it was Senator Grassley, one of the senior Republicans, in which he was offering concessions. They were saying, yes, we'll think about it. Maybe if you do this, maybe you do that. And Obama eventually looked at him and said, I think no matter what I do, you're not going to go along with us, are you? And the senator said, no, actually we aren't. And so I think Obama is talking in a different way now, that no concessions are going to work. And Biden has taken exactly the same lesson. Although he talks about unity, he does not mean by unity that we're going to wait around hoping to get a Republican to support us. And that's why this first package of $1.9 trillion in COVID relief, he's not compromising, and he's able to use the 50+1 to get it through, although in other cases it won't be so easy. But I do want to say something about the context, because I find Biden's rise very exciting. And I found a political scientist at Yale by the name of Stefan Skowronek, who has a framework that I find explains where we are and where we're going in a way that I find very useful and interesting, and it just rings true to me. He says there's a pattern in presidential history that goes in 40 to 60-year cycles. And on that basis, before the election, he anticipated Biden's victory, and that it would represent, even before it was clear who the Democratic candidate was, that Trump would be a one-term president, most likely. He doesn't guarantee these things. He's not saying these are immutable laws, but from his study of the patterns of history, this is what tends to happen, and that's what he expected to happen, and it did happen. That Trump would be a one-term president. He'd be the maverick outsider candidate, outsider to his own party, who tried to make big changes. But in the end, Skowronek sees him as a sign of the death of the old, rather than the start of the new. And he puts this in the context, and I'll only use the last two transformative presidents as the example. He says that the transformative presidents over the last 100 years, Franklin Roosevelt and Reagan, they bring a massive change. They follow a one-term president who is an outsider to his own party and a maverick and who tries to make changes. And before FDR, it was Herbert Hoover, who was a one-term president, an outsider to his Republican Party, tried to bring changes, failed. FDR comes in and signals a period of 40 years or so in which even Republican senators cannot break the main context that FDR set up of government having to take responsibility for its citizens. And you might, and as a perfect example, you might think of Nixon as a conservative, as we do, and yet Nixon, as a conservative Republican president, initiated the Environmental Protection Agency, which you cannot imagine a Republican doing now, and he extended Social Security, both of which would be seen as in the context of FDR. After that cycle was coming to its end, the next one before Trump was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an outsider to his establishment. He was the first, he tried to make big changes. He was a maverick in his way to his party, but he failed. He was a one-term president. That ushered in Reagan, who of course brought the big changes, small government, low taxes. And by the way, the whole FDR period, that 40-year period from the 30s to the late 70s, inequality in America declined steadily. Taxes, even under Republicans, were astronomically high by today's standards, and yet the economy worked very well, and inequality declined. From the Reagan era, inequality has steadily grown. So in the end, Skorenik argues that Trump, Carter, and Hoover, who he puts all in the same camp, are presidencies that are not terribly significant, except as a sign of massive change to come. They represent the dying of the old order rather than the coming of the new one. What does that tell us about where we are today? So now the interesting thing is, like FDR, Biden's early years do not reflect someone who's going to be a tremendous agent of radical long-term change. Biden was always a centrist in his party, but that doesn't really matter in terms of this analysis, which I agree with. That effectively Biden has seen his moment, he's understood the moment, and he's realized that what's needed is massive, radical, large-scale change. And the large-scale change, in many ways, is larger than FDR had to deal with, because he's got to deal with the COVID crisis. He's got to deal with the economic devastation of the COVID crisis. He's got to do with climate change, which of course is a massive new event. And he's also determined to deal with the civil rights issues and race issues that were left over. And I'm very interested in this writer, Ira Katznelson's book, Fear Itself, which you may be able to see. This book is a history of FDR's changes and how he radically changed the notion of the state in America for 40 years or more. And he makes the point that FDR had to make a bargain, that he would not tackle the big civil rights issues of his day, because and we don't have time to go into the context of the bargain. The bargain is on all sides, but the Southern white senators were so powerful that if he had done so, he could not have achieved what he achieved in bringing in the welfare state. And so he made that compromise. But Biden is someone who is, in a sense, going to take the FDR legacy, but be able and is determined to add the civil rights reforms that FDR did not address. To be a transformative president, this Yale political scientist says you've got to do more than change policies, you've got to change the game, you've got to bring structural reform. And it's possible and Biden is going to try to tackle those. Of course, it's very hard to say where he'll get stopped and what he'll achieve. But one piece of structural reform would be to renew and revise the Voting Rights Act, which was passed in the 60s under Lyndon Johnson and was undermined by Supreme Court decisions over the last 20 years. And so that's a structural change because it will change the voting patterns and impact in southern states, particularly where you have a strong African American community that have been discouraged from voting by various statutes and local actions. If they can get rid of the filibuster, that would be a structural change. If they can get Washington D.C. to the status of a state, and they've got reasons to claim it now, because one of the reasons that the January 6th event was so slow in being stopped was because they, as a non-state, they don't have their own National Guard that they can deploy without permission from the federal government, and that wasted some time, as we saw in the evidence in Congress yesterday. So and then they're also looking at changing the Supreme Court. I don't know if they'll do that, but those are all things that start to build institutional change that will extend beyond Biden, who one has to assume will be a one-term president because of his age.
Thank you, John. I'm just going to remind you set a nice platform, and we will have an opportunity to really engage with those issues. I want to turn to Francis and hear his sort of reflections. And Francis, just you don't have to necessarily respond directly to this, but it would be nice to bring this into your reflections as well. Is how much of what we are seeing now with the Biden administration was this more a rejection of Trump than necessarily a victory for the for Biden in the sense that these issues that America have been grappling with will still be a real challenge for the kinds of radical changes that some in the Democratic Party are calling for, on the Green New Deal, for example, issues on immigration, issues on taxation. Was that rejected, or was Trump rejected, and mainly also given the way in which he mishandled the COVID pandemic? So if you can weave those sort of reflections into your comments, I think our audience will appreciate it. So over to you, Francis.
Okay, thank you, Russell. And let me say, first of all, I want to say that there is a QAnon conspiracy theory that says that Trump will be back as president on the 4th of March. So look out for March the 4th. Having said that, I think that the short of it is that the election was more a rejection of Trump. But what we're looking at is a very fluid situation in terms of alignments and so forth, and we won't have a clear picture on where things are going for about another 2 years or even until 2024. But let me start out by saying that the January 6th carefully planned attack on the Capitol, in my view, represents a culminating exclamation point ending the Trump presidency, which can be viewed as having begun at its very outset as a protracted coup attempt based on a voter fraud big lie campaign already adopted by Republicans as a voter suppression strategy. One aimed at compensating for their shrinking voter base, which has radicalized them towards far-right extremism propelled by an extremist media ecosystem of which the Murdoch empire features prominently. The pro-Trump insurrection itself leads into the following areas of future possibilities, now defined by two recent events in the past 2 days, or maybe 3 events in the past 2 days. The U.S. Supreme Court's green light to the Southern District of New York to subpoena Donald Trump's tax returns and other documents related to the Trump Organization, coinciding with Senate Judiciary confirmation hearings for Biden Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland, who prosecuted the Oklahoma bombing of 1995, which killed 168 people, and who will make investigating the January 6th Capitol attack a top priority on the Justice Department's priority focus in fighting white supremacist domestic terrorism, punctuated by the January 6th attack on Congress. Now, and this goes along with the fact that the Senate has begun hearings on the January 6th attack. Now, the Supreme Court decision has implications for Trump's political future and for the power struggle within the Republican Party, on the future of the party between Trump and anti-Trump forces, and whether or not the Republican Party can restore credibility as a governing party in a two-party democratic system. Because at this point, the two-party system is in a very shaky situation. At this point, the two-party system in the U.S. has to be considered very much in doubt, given Trump's hijacking of the GOP into a far-right extremist-dominated fringe movement of racial fascist white Christian nationalism, which is a major departure from traditional center-right conservatism. Now that defines the struggle going on within the Republican Party, and how that unfolds will have a bearing on some of the alignment dynamics. In other words, at this point, the U.S. does not have a reliably stable and functioning center-right alternative governing party to the current incumbent center-left Democratic Party. And this carries with it major domestic and international, foreign as well as domestic policy implications. The Biden administration has roughly 2 years to pass not only his current $1.9 trillion American Rescue COVID relief plan, but an equally massive follow-up economic recovery stimulus plan of capital infrastructure and public investment, the urgency of which was underlined by the Texas electrical grid failure, which also highlights the growing magnitude of the climate crisis. Now, the good news, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that outside of Congress, there is bipartisan support for Biden's rescue plan. 67% by a Gallup poll, including 34% of Republican and former Trump voters. Now, this is important because this could potentially expand the Democrats' congressional majority, or at least contain any Republican gains that would not be helpful to Biden's agenda. This could build momentum for follow-up infrastructure stimulus. Otherwise, and here's the bad news risk is where Republicans could make gains in 2022 that would sabotage Biden's recovery agenda, threatening a Republican White House return in 2024 that internationally would threaten return to an accelerated relative decline in America's global superpower status, along with heightened global governing and security instability. So there's a lot that rides on the domestic political dynamics unfolding within the U.S. at the moment. Biden's challenge: gain an 8-year restorative, stabilizing transition at home and abroad, leading into what the U.S. has to come to terms with as a post-global primacy leadership posture. In other words, the U.S. is going to have to, the foreign policy establishment is going to have to reckon with the fact that that primacy is over. I mean, and Trump, Trump brought that about during his administration, and I mean, you can actually see it in the way Europeans are greeting the return, are greeting Biden. They're very happy to see Biden back, but they're also making it plain that that their interests are not necessarily always going to be in sync with the U.S. So, and you have Macron talking about strategic autonomy. So the U.S. will have to come up with a more equitable power sharing arrangement with allies and a workable accommodation with adversaries, particularly, obviously, China and Russia. Multilaterally, in my view, the preferred global governance option under these circumstances would be to see some kind of a partnership dialogue between NATO and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is co-led by China and Russia. You know, a link to United Nations reform. Now this is all, such a posture is very critical in terms of the U.S. national interest in domestic renewal. If and this is where the big tug of war is taking place between Democrats and Republicans, and between so-called progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party, because the U.S. cannot sustain what one might call imperial overstretch in its foreign policy, and at the same time deal with domestic renewal. And domestic renewal is way over is way over is long needed. I mean, it's something that in terms of infrastructure, The U.S. has a crumbling infrastructure. There's massive public investment that's needed. So that means that the debate between the parties is going to be a debate on domestic policy, factoring in how much you invest in a continuing over budgeting of the military establishment and tax cuts. And this is where the Democrats right now seem to have an advantage. But this is going to depend on Biden being able to aggressively not only get the American Rescue Plan passed, but he's then going to have to also push through Congress a big public investment infrastructure stimulus, and it's going to be interesting to see how he navigates that, because Biden right now is not showing any radical changes in foreign policy from the traditional. Now that may be viewed as sort of a holding action right now, but issues having to do with the military budget, because if you're going to have domestic renewal, you can't just you can't just rescind the tax cuts. You've also got to pare down military spending so that you have enough in the budget to implement some of the changes that need to be made, which are going to be, now the Republicans don't like it, but a Green New Deal in some form or fashion is going to happen, simply because of the fact that climate change is a reality, and any infrastructure renewal is going to have to factor in that. So we'll see. My thing is that I don't think that, and I'll end on this note. I'm not sure that we have a complete realignment yet. Much will depend on what shakes out from Biden getting his rescue plan passed, particularly since a number of Republican voters, including those who voted for Trump, actually support Biden's plan. So you see, that could actually end up in a situation where Democrats, having made gains in the suburbs, are able to regain and or retain working class support, particularly since Biden has been making, throughout his campaign and now has been making a very strong outreach to the trade union movement. So this could then leave the Republican Party into almost a rump amid the divisions that you already have. So and the Republicans know that. You see, the problem with the Republican Party is that even though they gained some working class support, the Republican Party is not a working class party. They know that. So I think we're going to have to stay tuned to see how all of this shakes out. And I'll end my comments there.
Thank you, Francis. We've got some questions that are coming through on the chat, and implicit in the questions really is this tension between, I suppose we can call it a Trumpism and the personality Trump. And many of those who are on the call would like your sort of reflections as to whether it's Trumpism that is more popular within the Republican Party now, as opposed to Trump himself necessarily being the presumptive candidate in 2024. In other words, the issues around America First. I mean, Francis, you spoke about some of those issues, the taking care of our own, issues of immigration, and we see that that's becoming an issue again now, is what's happening on the southern border, the issues of taxes, which people are saying we don't want to necessarily see all of those reversed. And then, of course, some of the tensions around the Green New Deal. Of course, climate change is a reality, but people are also worried about the impact of some of these measures on the employment situation. So maybe if you can speak a little bit about that, because that is where I suppose the real challenge for the Republican Party is going to lie, is that that they know that some of the sort of Trumpism is popular and they can't abandon it, but they recognize that Trump may be an electoral liability. So, John, maybe we'll go back to you. You can unmute yourself, John.
Thanks. Well, Russell, that links to some of the questions. One of them was, what are the underlying issues that brought Trump in? Because that'll tell you whether it's Trump or Trumpism. And the underlying issue is that people feel left out. The modern economy doesn't help everyone equally. There's a K-shaped recovery at the economy, they'd call it. Some people are doing better even under lockdown, and others are doing worse. So you have people left out who feel left out because they're poor, because they don't have the right skills, and there also is a cultural and a racial part of them feeling left out. So the key, and the other question that was relevant to this was, what will it take to remove this danger of populism, whether it's Trump or Trumpism? And the answer, I think, is Biden has to succeed. That's an absolutely key thing, because if he fails, then the whole underlying issues that Trump raised will come back to the fore, and either Trump will address them or some future Trumpist will address them. I mean, I don't think Trump, there's also been another question about what will happen in 2024. Everything I see in Trump tells me Trump doesn't want to be president. He makes his money out of and gets his power out of running for president.
Right.
So it's not about what happens in 2024. It's about how he can exploit the situation as long as he can.
Thanks, Francis. Over to you.
Okay. Well, look, let me, this is a very kind of a complicated mixture. You can't really separate Trump, the personality, from Trumpism. And Trumpism is not a coherent ideological position. It's basically a grievance, an anti-government, anti-establishment grievance posture with no coherent policy definition. In fact, a good example of it was during the Republican National Convention. Most conventions come up with a platform. The Republican National Convention in 2020 didn't issue a platform. It was simply Trump. So that's why I think that if Biden is able to deliver, it's going to be difficult for the Republican Party to really articulate a coherent, opposition to Democrats in 2022 and 2024. Because what are they going to run on? I mean, they represent a minority. The advantage that they tend to have, though, is that they're much better on messaging in conjunction with their right-wing media ecosystem in mobilizing their base, but their base is a shrinking base. So I think that if Biden can successfully deliver in the next 2 years, so we're not talking about a lot of time, but if he can substantially do that, then I think that the Republican Party will have more time to try to sort itself out. Right now, Republicans are trying to have it both ways. I think former South Carolina governor and Trump's UN ambassador Nikki Haley is an excellent example. She came out slamming Trump and then tried to get a meeting with him in Mar-a-Lago, and he would have nothing to do with it. But the other thing that I think is going to have a major impact on Trump and Trumpism is are the legal challenges awaiting him, because if those challenges result in him being charged, that's going to he's already weakened. He's really going to become a spent force.
I think we want to come back to that issue because, again, it's this tension between the person and notwithstanding the fact that you pointed out, Francis, that there's nothing that's necessarily coherent about Trump ideologically, but there is this sort of sense of sort of Trumpism. Of course, it has a lot of the grievance and victimhood aspects to it, but there are also policies, whether one agrees or disagrees, that appealed to a particular.
Well, not
right?
really. Not really. I take issue with that. The Republican Party right now does not have any real policies other than tax cuts, resistance to spending. They don't. They don't have it. And you see, first of all, they deny that there's a climate change challenge. So they don't have a climate change policy alternative to the Democrats. They don't have a policy for domestic renewal because they don't believe in spending outside of building up the military budget. So the thing is that Republican policies have basically become exhausted. They can't continue talking about tax and spend Democrats. And when you listen to them, when you listen to the Republicans that you have now, you don't get any policy. All you get basically is resistance to doing something. So, but you see, the Democrats have not been very good in exploiting that. The Democrats have been very poor on messaging. So basically, when you look at the Republican Party, it's hollow. There's no there there. You see, let me just say this. What you have from the Republican Party instead of policies is that you have a culture war. That's what you have with Republicans right now. CW, culture war.
Okay, let's shift gear. We've got 5 minutes, and I think it would be good for you to sort of sum up. And I suppose there are 2 or 3 issues. I mean, one is, of course, will Biden himself be around for 2 terms? I mean, will he stand for a second term, given issues of age? I mean, we can't project too far into the future. We don't know. If not, who is there in the Democratic Party as the as the heir apparent, you know, of the next Democratic administration. And within the Republican Party, what's your sense? You know, this war that's happening between sort of traditional Republicans and, of course, this populist movement that Trump is now heading. What's your prognosis as to who will eventually come out on top? So quickly, John, you've been good in terms of your predictions up until now. We'll test you in a few years' time as to whether you were correct on these as well.
Okay, I'll give you my answers, but I'll also try. I see there are a couple of questions we haven't answered. I'll try and fill in my response to them at the same time. In terms of who the Democrats going to be in 4 years' time, the truth is, anybody who claims to know doesn't know. I think it's pretty clear that I can't imagine Biden running for a second term. He's too old. You can already see some decline in his cognitive skills. I think he's proving an excellent president so far, and I think his judgments have been very sure-footed. But I just cannot see him being a candidate in 4 years' time. So that turns all the spotlight onto Kamala Harris. And my view about Kamala Harris, I'm afraid, is not going to be very satisfactory, because I have no view about her yet. I think she's very skilled. I think she's proving herself in many ways to be potentially have the right kind of judgment and temperament for the job. But I think it's just too early for me to say that she can have what it takes to get the majority of the country to vote for her, especially given that she's a woman and she's a woman of color. So, but in any event, you know, I don't think there's enough to judge what she's going to seem like to people in 4 years' time, and then there'll be all the other candidates. So you can't really answer that. But I just would like, if you give me a moment, to fill in answers to a couple of the questions that have come up on the dial. The one is, I was asked about the Middle East. What can you read into the silence from the Biden administration in the Middle East? And I think the answer is a lot. It's very deliberate. Biden deliberately did not talk to either Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, or MBS, the Prince Mohammed bin Saud of Saudi Arabia, because he wanted to send a message. He wanted to send a message to Netanyahu, who insulted his boss, President Obama, when he was in office, by coming in and attacking him in the Congress while he was president and attacking and undermining his policies. So he's doing a reset, but he's doing it in this way. And I think the outcome will be to try and restore the Iran deal despite Israel's opposition, but also not to move in a big way to help. The other issue is, so somebody asked a good question, if I could just deal with us one very quickly, said, what is this new order you talked about that Biden's going to bring? And someone else said, well, what are the problems out of these new orders that you can anticipate? And I can answer those very quickly. The new order that Biden is going to try and install is going to be more democratic, which is to say end the voter suppression and make sure African Americans and others have a freer access to the vote. A major change on climate, to be proactive on climate change and a Green Deal, not exactly the Green New Deal of some of the left, but his own version. He's going to make major changes. I mean, South Africa should be thinking about the implications that motor cars around the world are going to go electric very quickly, and energy is going to change very quickly. Second, that the role of government is going to come back, that it's proactive. If people fall through the safety net, lose economic viability, the government has to play a bigger role, and the government has to be proactive in seeing the impact of policies like trade policies, which is something that the Republicans are very active about. And of course, Trump changed all of that, because Trump decided that the Republicans must be against free trade when all their recent history has been for free trade. So that has implications as well. And my last point is, what will the problems be that it raises? I think the problems are obvious. When you have a new order in the beginning, it's It's well-meaning, it's got good intentions, it addresses real problems. As the new order becomes old, it becomes ossified, the bureaucrats take over, and they use the laws as comfort blankets rather than as tool for solving problems, and so you do get new problems coming out of that.
Okay, thanks, John. Francis, quickly, or closing comments, and who's going to win this battle for the soul of the Republican Party?
Well, that's an open question. I think that that we won't really get a sense of that for about another 2 years. Right now, the traditional Republicans are very much on the back foot, as they say. But and the candidates who want to go in, who want to succeed Trump in his footsteps, are quite scary. Quite frankly, I mean, you're talking about Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who is a very evangelical, who's got a very evangelical, a hardline Christian nationalist position, which would be a real threat to U.S. and global security were he to become president, because he believes in the end of days. He believes in the apocalypse. You've got hardliners like Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, another potential warmongering president, and then extremists, like Hawley, Josh Hawley from Missouri, who led the Senate opposition to certifying Biden's election. So it's those are going to be some of the characters. Now, actually, ironically, the potential star, though I think her position has dimmed somewhat since she backtracked in trying to placate Trump, is former Governor Nikki Haley. She's actually the only viable female Republican potential presidential candidate, and she has the visibility and everything, but she doesn't seem to know whether she's coming or going when it comes around to Trump. So it's obviously I would predict, though, that if the Republican Party continues along the Trump path, it's not going to win. It's going to lose votes. It's going to lose elections. The Republicans have got to regain ground in the suburbs, and if they can't do that, then they're toast. But but one can never make one can never make firm predictions given how this goes.
Okay, well, thank you so much, both of you. You sort of it would be a very interesting outcome if we have two female candidates for the presidency in 2024, and both with a sort of Asian background, because Nikki Haley is Asian, and Kamala Harris, one of her parents is Asian.
Yeah.
Now that would be a very interesting turnout for the books. But thank you both. There's lots of food for thought, lot to mull over. As you say, it's a very fluid and changing situation, and we will watch keenly as this unfolds, and hopefully we may have some follow-up sessions where we can unpack some of the issues that we were not able to do today.
Mhm.
So thank you very much, and thank you to the audience who signed on for participating and for joining this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care and keep safe.